Welcome to this session on culture in 2013. I'd like to introduce two great speakers. The first one is Paola Antonelli, and she's a senior curator in the Department of Art and Architecture at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Just put your hands together.
Whenever nations or states find themselves in financial trouble, the first thing to go is culture. And culture is intended as this strange gobble of superfluous things and people that are almost parasites of society and that add very little to the bottom line. The problem that we have in culture is that we don't have any metrics, and sometimes policymakers only understand those numbers that they wear as badges and that defend them from any attacks. But in truth, culture is fundamental to progress. I'm going to give you the example of design. You know, designers, for instance, are definitely part of culture, and they stand between revolutions in everyday life. Whenever an innovation happens, say in science or in technology, like the internet, for instance, they make it from lines of code into interfaces that everybody can use, and so on and so forth. You can make this example for so many different amazing revolutions that would have never had become part of our lives without design. The same happens with literature and with arts, and every time there's a moment of crisis, as today, the arts become really fundamental as ways to discuss reality and to discuss the future. In fact, culture is a place of clarity and trust, or lack thereof. It's a place where people coming from different extractions can state their ideas visually, acoustically, with texts, with objects, with declarations, and then have these ideas either embraced or reneged. It's a place where the people can form their own critical ideas, and critical ideas are the most important matter today. Next year, I hope and I wish and I expect, because it's already started, that our relationship as cultural agent with politicians and policymakers will improve ever so slightly. From all sides, from science, from technology, from academia, from the arts world, this is becoming an impellent need to make sure that policymakers understand the need for a language that embraces also culture. You probably have heard about all the pushes towards STEM education, science, technology, engineering, and math, but the most recent push is towards STEAM, that inserts the A of the arts. Another important symptom is the importance of curators today, because, as I mentioned before, trust and critical sharpness is what we need today. And curators in many different areas have become the embodiment of this idea of criticism and trust. And you can hate them or love them, but they are points of reference. That's what will happen next year in all different countries, to begin with the United States and to go on with the United Kingdom and with France, where this is already advanced, but also in China and in Singapore and in India. Cultural actors will try to engage politicians and policymakers even more. Thank you very much.
So I'd like to welcome on stage Steve Crossan, who is the director of the Google Cultural Institute. And this is a virtual museum that brings together millions of online artifacts. Steve.
Thanks very much, and thanks for inviting us here. So the Google Cultural Institute sounds like a very fancy thing, but actually we're something very ordinary. We're an engineering group. Google has lots of these. And the Cultural Institute is an engineering group which tries to use software and technology for the benefit of culture. So we're very involved in culture, digitization, and the use of digital in the cultural sphere. And so I thought I would make a prediction about culture and the digital in 2013. So one thing we've noticed, we've been going for about 2 years, and one thing we've noticed is that the conversation has changed quite a lot in that time. For a long time, people were worrying about how do we digitize our culture? How do we best create the experience of a work of art or the experience of a performance in the digital sphere? But actually now we've been doing this for a really long time. People have been digitizing culture for about 20 years now. And now we have an enormous amount of material. And so it's more about how do we sweat those digital assets? How do we get the best value out of that material? Some people have already been doing this for a while. One of the things that, well, two of the things that digital the digital world does are very relevant to culture. One is they make material available to a very wide audience. And secondly, they can make it possible to get a lot of people together in the same place at the same time through social media and so on. And we saw the power of this, for example, in the Arab Spring in 2011. And once you bring these two things together, very interesting things happen. So the Met Opera, for example, has already been doing this for about 6 years now with its Live in HD, which goes all around the world, 60 countries now, 3 million visitors a year come and pay to see live performance of the Met simultaneously with something, with a show at the Met. The National Theatre in the UK is doing the same thing. And this sort of event-based simultaneous use of digital technology is becoming more and more interesting. The Secret Cinema group in London, who've sort of exploded this year, run events where they essentially use social media and no marketing budget to invite a lot of people to a secret location on a particular date to see a film which they don't know what the film is going to be in advance. The event is themed, they have sets, they have costumes, and when you get there, you see whatever the movie is. And they ran, simultaneously with the opening of Prometheus this year in the UK, they ran an event in a warehouse in Euston over several days, which took 3% of the UK box office of Prometheus in the UK. They got 30,000 people to turn up to a warehouse in the UK to pay to have this kind of experience. So that's my prediction for 2013, is that also this trend will affect culture from the museum, and the museum will break out of its walls and will be, we will be able to have these experiences simultaneously with the exhibitions that are going on in perhaps inaccessible places around the world using digital technology. And so I look forward in 2013 to being able to share with my Parisian design devotees in Paola's next exhibition at MoMA from an underused space perhaps in Paris or perhaps even from my own home using digital technology. Thank you very much.
So one of the questions I wanted to ask you both, what unites you both presumably is that you both curate at some level. And so one of the questions I wanted to ask was, how do you deal with the problem of curation in an era where there's just such a great volume of stuff? And sorry, that's the most articulate way I can put it, but stuff.
Yeah, well, it's not a problem at all. It's the only thing that I know how to do. So, I kind of lucked out. I think that if you have the mindset for that, curating is about taking one position, which might be wrong or right, but it's personal, and it's something that you can offer the world as your own, and the world can agree or disagree, but then you have to create around it a body of work that supports the idea, and that is also engaging enough that people will deal with it and will really take it in. So it's about, sometimes I think about it as reporting. We had at MoMA a great salon, and actually Jeff Jarvis was also there, about curators in different realms, so in journalism, on the internet, and even in music. And you realize that it's about synthesis and about also knowing your audience and gaining your audience's respect and trust.
Okay.
So actually to the premise of your question, at the Google Culture Institute, we don't really curate at all. And in fact, we're careful to try not to curate. Instead, what we do is we try and create tools for curators to enable them to curate online. So all of the material that is on our various projects has been curated by other people outside of the Institute. And what we're trying to do is to enable that to happen at scale. Because to your question, what do we do about the data deluge? Certainly, algorithmic approaches are part of that. Search is part of that. Being able to find what you're looking for if you know what it is part of that. But I think the human voice and the curatorial voice and the story, most importantly, I think is a huge part of the answer to how we deal with the data deluge. And enabling curators, enabling storytellers to tell their stories around the huge volume of digital material that we've got at scale, I think is one of the big challenges, and that's one of the working on. I think lots of other people are working on the same problem, but it's one of the big challenges for the future.
And is there a role more for sort of collaborative curation? Is it something that we should expect that individuals and experts should be doing on their own? Or should we be asking more broadly people to become involved in this process of curating our culture?
Why not? I mean, people can be amateur poets, amateur curators, they can be amateur everything. You know, it's, I don't think it's precluded. You know, there are so many different areas of expertise that I think the only idea is that one should have some sort of a code. It's not a written code, but I think it's peer pressure driven, whereby there's this sense of trust and expertise in something, so people can rely upon you for guidance.
Okay, and Steve, do you feel?
Yes, I think that one of the important problems that the digital technology has, and search in general, hasn't really yet solved is the problem of finding the right person to tell you the answer to your question. The fact that there is a huge profession of storytellers, historians, curators who can do that, and who are professionally trained to do that, but also who have a very particular and unique point of view.
Means that actually finding the right curator for your question, the right storyteller for your question, is also an interesting problem. Now, that might be somebody who hasn't previously been a professional storyteller before. For example, somebody who was there, in Tahrir Square in 2011, who in February 2011, who was there during the events, may have a very particular and interesting story to tell about that particular moment in history, even though they're not a professional curator.
Right, I'm going to ask for questions in a second. What I'm going to just say is one of the questions I want to ask in closing is that about what kind of story would you like to see told in 2013, whether there's some part of culture that you'd like to see emerging as a story. I don't know if that's a reasonable thing to ask. And then I'd like to ask for questions from the audience. If you could turn the lights down, is that possible? Can I? Hello? Okay, has anyone got any questions? Yes, there's a man there waving. Can we get him a microphone, please? Thank you. Just gentleman there with the jacket, yeah.
How is the,
could you use the mic, please, sir?
I beg your pardon?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay. How is the information technology revolution, which is what we're talking about in one form or another, going to change not so much the habits of people, we've heard a lot about that, but rather the culture and specifically the value systems of people, the kind of things that people deem to be important in the future that were not in the past. We've seen similar things with the Industrial Revolution centuries ago, in which the value system of people, what they thought was important, changed a lot. How would you compare the two, and what's your forecast for this change?
Great question.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there are, it is a great question, and there are sort of dystopian and utopian answers to this question. You may not be entirely surprised that working for Google, I tend to take the more utopian view on this debate. But I do think that it's true that digital technology enables more people to talk to each other than was possible in the past. And that fundamentally is probably a hopeful trend in terms of the effect on value systems going into the future and so on. It also radically changes the relationship between government and people, I think, going forwards. And that, I think, is also going to be an interesting trend. Paola sort of touched on this as well when she was talking about the importance of culture engaging with policy and policymakers. We're at this very interesting point at the moment in the culture where I think government and, not just the usual suspects, but many democratic governments around the world are sort of waking up to the power of information technology to mobilize citizens, perhaps not in always ways that they would be delighted with, and starting to look towards taking action around that. But at the same time, we have all of these countervailing trends where, as I said before, one of the things the internet can do is it can get a lot of people together in the same place at the same time for a particular purpose, and that is a sort of very interesting counterweight trend. So I think that debate between these two things over the next few years is going to be very interesting to follow. But I'm on the hopeful side of where it will come out.
And so am I, completely. I think that the internet has enabled a stronger sense of community, local, smaller communities of passion, of shared passions versus larger ones. I think it has enabled dialogue, therefore criticism, therefore establishing a position and having ideas and feedback over products, over events, over political developments. And also it has heightened the sense of trust. Trust is really one of the most important fundamental parts of our life today. Let's see.
Okay, gentleman down here, please.
Yeah, I'm curious about, Paola, I think you've got a new role in new initiatives or R&D with the museum. I'm curious about the value of arts-based research and development. I imagine with the art project at Google, as well as the Institute, that I want to understand institutionally, where do they see the value of initiatives like this?
You're gonna laugh, because the idea of the R&D came to me in 2008 during the financial crisis, and I said, okay, this is our opportunity. People finally got it. They cannot trust that sector. We might not provide immediate progress in productivity, but we can really give a sense of a slower, more holistic kind of development for society, blah, blah, blah. To make a long story short, schools and museums can be the true R&D of society, and therefore we should start an R&D department within MoMA. Now, this is one of the many layers of this department, which is truly an initiative at this point. But the idea for the museum world in particular is to find a way to work on the space that connects the physical with the digital. So it's not only digital, it's not only physical, it's about knowing that our mission is to educate and to preserve objects. Sometimes the objects are digital, but sometimes they're physical, and to consider the digital space as a space where we can enhance that educational mission and where we can create new means of bringing in the world into a realm that we find safe and productive, which is the realm of art. Did I explain it, or is that okay for you? Good.
Well, we've run over slightly. I'm not going to ask that question. I think our audience's questions were actually far more interesting than mine. So I want to thank you, and I'd like to thank our guests.
Thank you, Natasha.